So we're talking about the WHO treaty, the International Health Regulation. What is in a nutshell, James, your main concern here?
Okay, most people are completely unaware that last May, on May 27th, 2022, during the World Health Assembly, a set of amendments to international regulations were adopted. Okay, and along with that are rules in the international health regulations that every nation has 18 months to reject them. You could just send a letter to the WHO and say, no, thank you. People think, oh, well, I'm going to speak to my representative in Parliament or in Congress, and they're going to be able to do something about it. What people don't understand is the amendments that were adopted last year are not like a treaty. They're amendments to an existing agreement, and there will be no signature needed. There will be no vote in Parliament or Congress or the Senate. The structure of how this operates is it is assumed that you're okay with what your delegate agreed to unless you proactively reject them under Article 61 in the IHR. There's an 18-month period where every nation has the opportunity to just say no. And we've wasted 12 months. There's been just absolute silence. As far as I can tell, not a single politician anywhere in the world has spoken a word about it. So we do have 6 months left. And in Canada, in the UK, in Australia so far, good people have stepped up and put in petitions because those nations do have a petition system. Tess Lawrie in the UK put forth a petition so that it would be debated in Parliament. If you go to uk.stoptheamendments.com, you can sign the petition if you agree with it and want this to be discussed, because silence equals consent. And that's the difference.
So the international health regulations that were actually approved on the 27th of May 2022, they'll come into force in 6 months' time unless someone actually stops them. What is in that provisional set of amendments, James?
In the middle of last year's assembly, a number of nations, the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, sponsored a different set of amendments. There were amendments to 5 articles, and the main important one was a change to Article 59 of the International Health Regulations, which would seek to shorten the time period that future amendments would then be, you'd have an opportunity to reject them or they would go into force. So the changes that are winding their way through this 18-month period would change that 18-month period down to 10 months. They had tried to get it all the way down to 6 months. They were negotiating. They said 9. They ended up settling on 10 months. So if that had been in effect for last year, we would have already missed the opportunity to reject them, and time would have been up. They also changed the time period from 24 months to 12 months, that it would actually go into legally binding effect. So they're tightening the schedule down for the next round of amendments. But the bigger issue, just to repeat, the time frame is important, and all of the details of the amendments that are being negotiated now are important, but it's important to understand that unelected, unaccountable, unknown delegates who meet in Geneva are empowered to make the decision, and then it is assumed that you're okay with it unless you proactively reject it. And it's not the people or the parliament who have the authority to do that. It's just whatever leader it is in your nation that has authority to communicate with the WHO. If President Biden doesn't say no, or if your prime minister doesn't say no, then it's just going to go through. And unfortunately, both the United States government and the UK government were the ones who sponsored this, and nobody ever told the people. There are things that people can do in the United Kingdom. You could go to uk.stoptheamendments.com, sign a petition there. You can go to australia.stoptheamendments.com to sign the petition there. Unfortunately, you've missed the opportunity to go to canada.stoptheamendments.com, but they only needed 500 signatures, and I think they got almost 19,000 in 30 days. In the UK, you need 100,000 because you have a larger population, and it would result in a public discussion of this amendment situation. But I'd like to rewind just a little bit to give the explanation of how this all came to be. Last May, in addition to adopting the amendments that we've been discussing, the World Health Assembly also adopted a plan to encourage other nations to update the international health regulations. And so they said to all the nations, by September 30th, please submit any proposed amendments. So on September 30th, or a little bit thereafter, a couple of nations were late. There was 197 pages of proposed amendments. They tallied them up. There were 307 specific amendments to the international health regulations. They pretty much kept that completely secret until mid-December. And they revealed them in mid-December. I reported on it. The issue is the power to approve or disapprove them, or fail to approve them or reject them, has been taken away from the people and their representatives and has been shifted to the executive branch in most governments. And so it's not the case that any of those amendments are going to be reviewed by Parliament or voted on in any kind of referendum or any such thing. It's your executive branch of your government that will be required to enforce the agreements or the obligations under the agreements. Now, this isn't normally where I start, but because it's your question, Russia proposed an amendment to Article 4 of the International Health Regulations. And you can dig up the 197-page document and scroll down to Russia, and you'll see that they, if the amendments were to be adopted, it would require the government of each nation to enact legislation, or that could come in the effect of a regulation from some ministry or agency, or it could be an executive order, however they might implement it. The nations would be obligated to enact legislation to have something called the International Health Regulations focal points, which I bet you didn't know you had one of those, John. Okay, every nation has a
Did not.
national IHR focal point, and their current job, their obligation, is if there is some kind of an outbreak in the nation, they are supposed to be in 24/7 communication with the WHO, and if there's a problem, and it could be a worldwide problem, if there's some sort of pathogen or a chemical spill or radiation leak or something like that, they're supposed to immediately alert the WHO and start the process of alerting the world. Okay? Well, everyone has an office in their nation that has that connection to the WHO, but they would require expanding the authority of that IHR focal point to enforce the obligations that have been agreed to if the delegate agrees to any subsequent amendments. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the many different amendments, and I'll try to touch on 3 or 4 real quick if you think that's the next thing I should probably do.
This is just incredible. So we've got decision makers in Russia working through unelected bureaucrats in the World Health Organization, working through unelected bureaucrats in the United Kingdom and the United States to enforce laws on you and me.
That's the soundbite. Exactly. And so, some of the
Incredible.
some of the proposed amendments were jaw-dropping. I still recall.
Yeah, let's go for those, James,
I
please.
was sitting right where I was sitting right now when I first read it, and I saw my jaw just hang open. I couldn't believe what I was reading,
Yeah.
but it's all in print. So Bangladesh proposed a change to Article 1, and Article 1 is just all of the definitions. And in that, I think you're aware of this, I think you've already reported on this, the current definition of a standing or a temporary recommendation is that it's non-binding advice. Well, that's what a recommendation is. Everybody knows that, okay? Well, they would cross out the words non-binding. Other nations have put forth a multitude of, 307 amendments, but the clearest one is from Malaysia, where they said the standing and temporary recommendations under Articles 15 and 16 shall be implemented. Okay, so moving on, because that's pretty darn bad right out of the gate. That's article number one. Let's just change the meaning of the word recommendation. Article number two currently defines the scope of the IHR, the International Health Regulations. The scope says if there's an emergency, then the IHRs come into play. Well, what's an emergency? Well, they've actually expanded on that and changed the wording in many different amendments, not just this one, to state if there is the potential for an emergency, then he can declare a public health emergency of international concern, PHEIC, or FAKE. Okay. They also want to let the regional directors, there's 6 regions in the WHO, well, that person would be empowered to declare a public health emergency of regional concern. India proposed crossing out language in Article 3, and I think you've probably even reported on this one as well. When I read the international health regulations for the first time last year, and I got to Article 3, and it said that the regulations shall be implemented with full respect for the dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of people. I took a breath and I said, well, that doesn't sound so bad. Let me keep reading, right? I'm okay with that. There's a bunch of things in the current IHRs that I'm not happy with, and I would like to make some amendments, but it wasn't that one. And so when I read that India would cross those words out, they would cross out with full respect for the dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of people. And you can read their document, and the line's going right through the words. I was slack-jawed. I was like, and then I realized, oh, wait a minute, James, I'm an optimist. That's a blessing. That is so egregiously, just flat out wrong. Okay? Well,
Yeah.
It maybe wasn't a mistake.
Anyone can see that is outrageous.
I've personally worked in situations, not, crisis emergencies, but, you got a job, you got to do it quickly, things got to be organized, you got to, direct and dictate and delegate, but you don't tell somebody to do something that's against their moral fiber. You don't tell them to violate their religious beliefs or do something that they feel the risk outweighs the benefit. You direct traffic, you dictate orders, you make things happen with respect, not dictatorial totalitarian control over what you do. And so the definition of a dictator comes from the person who's put in charge to dictate orders when there's an emergency. And so they seem to have realized that if they can keep an ongoing, permanent state of emergency, the United States, last time I checked, is operating under, I forget the number now, it's probably changed. It was over 40 states of emergency that have been declared, and they just keep renewing them. So the President of the United States has emergency powers for all of these many things, and then you wonder why your rights are being trampled on. Emergency or not, respect for human rights is a given, and if they could put into writing and speak in public that they want to, get rid of those rights, I think that ought to grab people's attention. Now, there's one more amendment that I want to, or
Please.
pile of amendments that I would like to talk about. The European Union, as a group, has proposed a number of amendments that fall under the category of a global digital health certification network. Now, it's not just the UK, there's also nations in Africa and India and Russia and Indonesia. And the clue about this was given by the Indonesian health minister at the B20 back in November. He said, well, you remember back in 2020 when we had to lock down the world? It's like, well, that was a choice. You didn't have to take that action. You're responsible for that choice. And then he said, well, that that hurt the economy. It's like, well, yes, but it mostly hurt the big box, Amazon, Walmart, those big stores. It didn't it didn't hurt them. It hurt the small mom and pop stores. Then he said, well, what we want to do is have a vaccine certificate, a prophylaxis certificate, a testing certificate, a recovery certificate, so that if you're properly vaccinated, which there's a question there, I'll just leave it at that, or if you're properly tested, which might even be a bigger question, then you can move around. That's the start of the global digital ID tracking and tracing China social credit system. I actually have in my possession a little vaccine passport. My girlfriend traveled back in the 1970s, and this form is actually in Annex 6 of the International Health Regulations. They want to dramatically expand that and digitize it so that everybody gets a unique QR code. And before you book your flight, you're not going to be able to if your QR code gives you a red light instead of a green light. Now, let's change the mindset and talk about the treaty, okay? And it goes by many names. They have called it a convention, agreement, or other international instrument. Most people have referred to it as the pandemic treaty. They've been calling it the pandemic accord. People know what a treaty is. Usually you have a war, and at the end of the war, you divvy up the territory and you end the war and you move on, okay? A framework convention is a nefarious little thing in my mind. You find some language that you can agree to, and you make it so that people get into the agreement, but it's just a framework. It's kind of like a Christmas tree. You put a Christmas tree in your living room, and then you start hanging ornaments on it. Okay. Oh well, let's hang this protocol on the framework convention. Well, when do you do that? You do that after everybody's agreed to the framework. Well, what if people wanted to put different ornaments than if you've envisioned how you would decorate your Christmas tree? But I encourage everybody to go to chapter 3 on page 31 for the remainder of the document. There would be a bureaucracy constructed, which would be the conference of the parties. You probably are familiar with that with climate change. They have a COP27. They're going to have a COP28. COP stands for Conference of the Parties, which is a bureaucracy that when the treaty is agreed to, and I will call it a framework convention, when that framework is laid out, the new boss, is the Conference of the Parties. Well, who chooses them? Who are they? They've listed 3 separate committees and a panel of experts who would be in charge of implementing the different agreements in the treaty. And that is where you lose control. Delegates are allowed under Article 19 and 20 of the WHO Constitution to enact a convention or an agreement. That's where the CA plus comes from. It comes from the wording in the WHO's Constitution, Article 19 and 20. So the World Health Assembly is empowered by the Constitution of the WHO to adopt a convention. Well, when they adopt the convention and they pass on authority to the Conference of the Parties to then hang ornaments on your Christmas tree, to add protocols to the agreement, how do you stop those protocols? And you're not even going to know that they happened. Do you know all of the protocols that they've put in place for the COP 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 through to 28?
No idea.
It's so far away from the will of the people. It's this unknown, unaccountable, unelected band of authority figures. None of this should be happening because it's all predicated on a decision that was made in 2021 at the assembly there. They decided to have a special session of the assembly in late November, December 2021. I'm going to guess most people didn't get a memo about that. You didn't get to weigh in with your delegate at late November 2021. What they ended up deciding was that, oh, we need to have a treaty. If anybody reads the bulk of the treaty, it reads to me like a venture capital prospectus. They're going to have a logistics network. They're going to have a pathogen access and benefit sharing system. If you find a pathogen because you stuck something up somebody's nose, or you take a sample somewhere, or you do some genomic sequencing, share that. Everybody wants to have access to that information because that information is valuable. That becomes intellectual property, and you can monetize that. And so the benefits that need to be shared are all of the products that you can make because you've identified there's this scary proposed pathogen. Okay. Then they want the manufacturers to operate under, I'll go back to the amendments, Article 13A, they want the Director General to be able to create an allocation mechanism so that he could immediately determine upon the declaration of the potential of an emergency that these are the required pandemic response products that he has determined are needed, and tell country A to make those products and ship them to country B. And so the other aspects of what they want to build out are a laboratory network. Okay. And so the problem that we dealt with was this case-demic idea of, well, let's do all this testing. The more testing you have, the more cases you have. Forget that they're asymptomatic and they may or may not be spreading anything. Because we did a test of your farm or your wastewater treatment plant or your chicken coop or your companion animal when you took them to the vet, or every time you go to the doctor, we got to do a test to see if, boy, the best place to find some of the hardiest pathogens are in the hospital. They've got all kinds of antibiotic resistant stuff there. They want money to flow as venture capital into building out this laboratory genomic sequencing, database management, surveillance network. There's no discussion of how do you make people healthier. This is venture capital. And again, the Indonesian health minister said the words out loud back at the B20. He was talking about what's now called the World Bank Pandemic Fund. It used to be called a FIF. So what he actually said is FIF, Financial Intermediary Fund. They get all of the nations, all of the large nonprofit organizations like Bill and Melinda Gates to put money into a big pile, and then they have intermediaries distribute it. Financial Intermediary Fund, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, so forth and so on, the WHO. And so the United States back in 2021 started the negotiations for this idea. In November of 2022, they announced it, and that's when the Indonesian health minister said, hey, everybody, he's talking to all the business people. The United States has started this FIF, this World Bank Pandemic Fund, as it's now called. It's ultimately going to be a $10 billion a year fund to build out pandemic response product manufacturing infrastructure. This is a great business opportunity, he said. Go invest. Let's go look everywhere for a pathogen, by whatever definition. And oh, look at that. We've already made the products that you must have. Because under the amendments, the recommendation to have those products is now an obligation. And you can't travel unless you get them. And so the documents, are intertwined, but the things that the treaty would seek to do are not what a lot of people have attributed to it. Thus, the fact checkers give everybody a hard time. And so my take on it is, where's the after event review of, oh, we went along with what you told us to do, and that didn't work out so good. And the things that you said were things we should do proved to have much more risk than benefit. So did we learn anything?
European Union, Saudi Arabia, India, Russia, I don't think we mentioned China, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Malaysia, United Nations, all with amendments, but the UK without. It's very, very telling. So, well, basically, on behalf of democratic peoples around the world, thank you.
I'm just trying to get people to straighten out this crazy pile of words that are coming out of the WHO, and I appreciate the opportunity to do that. Thank you so much.
James, thank you. And of course, all the links will be in the description below. Check it out and do what you will with that. James, we really appreciate it. I can see the amount of work you've put into this and your dedication, and I really respect that. And thank you very much for your time today.
Well, right back at you, John. Thank you for all you do.